Mindbend, non-ordinary and extraordinary states of consciousness for Mindbend Creative.
Amina, thank you so much for coming on the podcast today. As you told me before we started, you've just been through 5 days of a conference and a little worn out. So feel free to slouch away or fall asleep if you need to. Hopefully it'll be a little more stimulating than that. For those of you watching, for those of you listening, you won't be able to tell where she's speaking from, but happy to have you here. Mindbend, non-ordinary and extraordinary states of consciousness. And consciousness ties directly to neuroscience, is my layperson's understanding. So am I correct in understanding that neuroscience is a passion of yours?
Totally, yeah.
Okay, so how do you act as a conduit between the people you work with, the people you speak to or speak in front of as a public speaker, and the wealth of knowledge that you've accrued over time?
It's a hard question, right? Because it's like...
Get the hard ones out of the way first. And
get
then
it out.
Yeah.
I feel like this is like my life's work, and to answer your question, I sort of have to talk about my heritage and where I'm from.
And there's a TEDx talk that I had wanted to see. I didn't get the link to work, but I think maybe we can put it in the notes for the show if it's still available for people to watch. But I'm interested to learn more about your heritage, so I'm glad you want to talk about it now.
Yeah. In the TEDx, I also spoke about my heritage. Basically, the TEDx was about how we use figurative veils to separate ourselves from people. And then I used the juxtaposition of being from Afghanistan and having to wear a physical veil, and how we do that psychologically and emotionally. But like my heritage is Afghani. And so I, understanding epigenetic trauma and generational trauma, I inherited a lot of trauma, like this experience from my parents growing up in war. Yeah. And I always asked myself, like, is this it? Like, are we just always this anxious in life? Like, is there some other way that we can exist? And so I just remember, really being very curious about spirituality when I was 10. And I started doing yoga when I was 16. And by the time I was 19 or 20, I was like in India. And I just started to learn and get really curious about consciousness. And for the first time in my life, having meditated and like explored my inner self, I felt fucking better. Like I actually felt better. I didn't realize that I was like under a table with my, like trying to like stand up straight. And I remember the day that like I walked out of my like meditation retreat in India. I was 19, and I just, for the first time, I felt so tall and normal and happy. I was like, this is what it's like up here when you're not, in anxiety and distress. And so then when I got home, I just wanted to connect spirituality with my brain. And I found neuro-linguistics. And neuro-linguistics is this idea of combining root cause analysis, behavioral neuroscience, psychology, somatic work. Like I studied all of this for 4 or 5 years after college. And it became my identity and my mission to share this with people, not just the companies that I work with. I typically work in tech and entertainment, but just with women of color like myself, with South Asians, with other Afghanis, with traditional Asian cultures where we feel so suppressed and not able to access freedom emotionally.
Suppressed in the institutional sense,
emotionally.
Yeah.
Because that's why I'm doing all this work, is to help people understand and unlock their pain, the root causes of their pain, change their brain, create plasticity in their brain, and be free.
Yeah, and I thought that was one of the main reasons why I thought there was a strong tie, although not overt to the casual observer, but that's what a lot of people are coming to the psychedelic experience for. Unlocking the opportunity for transcendence of suffering, or alleviating the pain that's ongoing throughout a life from root cause or root trauma. Talk about epigenetic trauma, because when I think about that, I think about you as a little organism coming up inside of you. Look, a lot of it feels very metaphysical to me, right? Like it's the sense of like an awareness or the energy of of an awareness as it compiles throughout generations, right? So talk to us about your understanding of epigenetic trauma and maybe merge the metaphysical and the physiological.
Yeah. Well, just on a basic level, epigenetic is trauma is the transmission of trauma from the parent to the child. And there are some studies done about Holocaust survivors. And what they found is that people who had survived the Holocaust had children, and their kids had very similar experiences and fears as if they'd gone through the Holocaust themselves. And I don't know the biology or the scientific research specifically, but it was like the parents passed on the same DNA, and there was like a tear in the specific DNA from the mother to the kid. And while the kid did not experience being in the Holocaust, they had the same genetic code as if they had. And
It was an indelible mark that was left in
Yeah.
the actual matter.
Yeah, exactly. Wow. So science is telling us that actually, if I am somebody that has experienced intense trauma and I have a child and that trauma is unhealed, my child will take on my unresolved trauma emotionally, psychologically, somatically, and I'll pass it down. And connecting that to psychedelics, for example, psychedelics is one of the most fucking profound ways to stop generational trauma, because what it does is it takes us out of our perspective. It connects the back of our brain, which is our emotional center, to the front part of our brain, which is our logic center. Normally they're not connected, but it's like these two bridges, right? Like we'd be going crazy if we, if our emotional brain talked to our logic brain all the time.
Good point.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And doing ayahuasca, for example, or DMT connects these two like open bridges connect. And now for the first time in your life, you have access, you like to your amygdala. Amygdala is your trauma center. It's like every single thing that's ever happened to me that hurt or was painful or deeply traumatic gets stored. It's like a trash can. And it's like it's stored in this trash can. And you know what we do to survive as kids is we take the lid of the trash can. We're like, shut it.
Shut the grouch in there.
Yeah. And then we think our anxiety is because of what my boss did or what my partner did, or we think it's because of what so-and-so did, but really we get this unconscious flashback of something that occurred to us as kids, comes out from the amygdala. Our brain hasn't processed that trauma, and so it comes out as anger or rage or anxiety. And what psychedelics can do is stop that pattern of really us lying to ourselves.
Stops it because it provides the opportunity to understand the phenomenon that's occurring.
Absolutely. You see it. So like back to your question about epigenetic trauma, like literally if you understand the source of where your pain comes from, then you have a choice in changing it. And when you change your belief structures, your neural pathways fire differently. And when your neural pathways fire differently, right, it's changing your brain chemistry. And so like you're changing yourself through personal development. So the number one way we can actually ensure that our children and the future is free and clear is by doing our own personal work today. And I think psychedelics is one of the best ways to do it. Now, I will say, I think it takes tremendous support. Like if people are going to embark on this journey of psychedelics, it's very important to have someone you trust that can work with you pre-psychedelic, post-psychedelic, because 90% of the work is integrating what you discover, right? Like psilocybin, for example, it doesn't rewire you particularly. I mean, it does. A lot of research shows that, but it just brings to the surface everything that you've been sort of suppressing. But if you don't have a container or somebody to sort of integrate that with and process, it might do more harm than good, right? If somebody discovers that they were raped or molested and they have no ability to process that, then that's new information to them that's not particularly helpful.
But those aren't the anecdotes that we hear the majority of the time when people talk about casual psychedelic experiences.
No.
Most of the recollections and anecdotes that people share about are experiences where it was a fun gathering, or it was done on the purpose of recreation or relaxation or experimentation. And it seems like there's almost two camps of intentionality behind the experience. But most people's initial impressions are from the loose cannon side, where it's not at all about taking some sort of life-changing lesson away or incorporating insights through integration.
Yeah. I mean, for me, I'm a big proponent of guided medical psychedelic experiences.
Which compounds, like what substances?
Really, I think whatever calls to people. I'm a huge fan of ketamine.
Mm-hmm. Oh, really?
Yeah, I think ketamine, I mean, it's not particularly a psychedelic, but it's profound and it's amazing. I'm also a big fan of psilocybin, of MDMA for trauma. Mm-hmm. I think it's incredible.
Which modality for ketamine administration? Like the intravenous or intravenous?
Yeah, I mean, really, there's so many options now. Mm-hmm. They have ketamine lozenges where you can just do it at home.
Yeah.
They have IV. You can, to your point, get intravenous. There's so many options. People use ketamine in a party setting. And even that, I recommend that over cocaine. I think if you're going to be at a party and if people will do what they do, I recommend using ketamine in a party substance over, cocaine any day.
Wow.
Yeah.
What's your experience with cocaine been? What's your viewpoint on the effects of cocaine on the brain or the spirit or atmospherically? Like, do you have negative connotations around that particular?
No, I don't have any negative connotations. I mean, I think that, I don't particularly think it's like an enhanced positive substance. I wouldn't tell people like, hey, do cocaine. I would recommend ketamine. I think if people are partying and they choose to party and they don't want to drink alcohol, ketamine can actually reignite the dull circuitry in your brain, where I feel like cocaine will sort of dull it. Like there's a come down from cocaine that I think ketamine doesn't have, just from a pure party perspective.
Yeah.
But I'm not, I don't really even want to,
Yeah, you're not here to advocate one way or the other.
If you're going to Coachella soon, do ketamine instead of Coke. Like that's,
Well, these are things that are happening, and
I'm just saying,
part of navigating the space. Where we're at this point in time, and especially when you look at like legislation, right?
Yeah,
and you look at like how do we shape the future by affecting change today, and what kind of world do we want to create as we go along? It's like how do you view food?
Exactly.
What is the functionality of food in our life, and when do we think of food as more of a medicine or as more of a maintenance accessory than just a hole patcher or a desire satisfier, right? And I'm always interested in this media landscape of trying to share this information in a way that can speak to somebody at a formative time, wherever that is in their life, whether they're in their adolescence or whether they're in a later life like period of transition. We need to have these entry points.
Totally.
Right? So safe entry points has been like the sort of core of my aim through my journalistic efforts and just exploring the space, right?
No, for sure. You're right about that. You're absolutely right about that. Safe entry points is critical, because if somebody has a bad experience with acid, for example, and they're like, I'll never do psychedelics because in college I took too much acid.
Totally.
That's not the vibe.
Right. So do you ever get into this particular topic in the bookings that you're brought in for? Because if I understand correctly, you're brought in to address audiences and make presentations that are meant to leave somebody with a particular kind of takeaway. And that's, talk a little bit more about that world and how you're brought in.
Yeah, thank you.
Sure.
Yeah, I mean, when I'm invited to speak, I usually combine research on brain science and a topic that the company or organization wants to cover. So like I recently spoke for an entertainment company in Madrid, and it was like women from all over the world, and they wanted to talk about overcoming limiting beliefs. Limiting belief, well, let me just take a step back. A belief is just this view that you have about the world, and a limiting belief is one that limits your view of the world and yourself. And so I spoke about what limiting beliefs are, how they interact with your brain, how emotion can bind these neural pathways. So like if, for example, like something really bad happens to you, like in that moment, we're like, we feel so afraid or scared, and we make up a meaning about ourselves that I'm bad. Bad things are happening to me. I'm bad. My dad didn't love me. I'm stupid, whatever. We always blame ourselves as children. And so I sort of deconstructed that conversation and talked about my background and explained the brain science of that. And then, so like that's kind of like what's so cool about my work. Like I am so passionate about this because I just don't feel like there's a lot of women from Afghanistan, my culture, talking about these two topics. And it's just so interesting because they'll say, we really want our sales teams to perform. We want these people to, do whatever. And I'll go in and speak about my culture and my background and the brain science. And somehow that combination, I feel like it's different. And I think people are really becoming open to it. And I think it's inspiring. That's all I want to do is just educate and inspire.
Your background is part of your allure on the professional level, part of your mystique. Yeah. Well, what's your connection currently to women from Afghanistan in particular? Do you have any kind of network, or are you learning about people like yourself who are coming up and learning about yoga or expatriating and finding and still trying to be mindful of where they're from and how to advance the cause of other women in that space?
I'm just like so interested in it. When like, this is a very big topic for me actually, because like when we moved to the United States, I was like 7 years old. My mom divorced my father when I was 9. And in our culture, the woman doesn't actually divorce her husband. It's like out of our culture for something like that to happen. And so I sort of lost touch with my community, with the Afghan community, because usually women are ostracized if they leave a family or a cultural dynamic. Right?
Divorce is not a common or condoned practice in Afghanistan.
So, right. But so even coming to America, finding this Afghani community, it's like I was just so separate from it because my mom left my father and we just sort of lost touch with that part of ourselves, which makes me so sad because I think my culture and being Afghani and the traditions and the people and the hospitality and the collectivism is one of the most beautiful things I've ever seen in the world. Like, I've traveled the world and I truly, truly love my culture, but I don't have a deep connection to it because of what happened, because my mom sort of left my dad and then she just kind of stayed away because it's like she wouldn't be accepted by the community because she did that, And so she gave us an opportunity to really be ourselves.
You have siblings?
I have 3 older sisters, And so what's very interesting to me right now, being where I am in my life, is like, I'm sure there are many family units that have immigrated from Afghanistan to the US or Europe or different parts of the world where there's a lot of emotional distress and it's dysfunctional, and the kids could not have the freedom to explore their emotions or explore themselves because the family unit stayed together. And maybe it was toxic, And I want to be able to maybe give some tools and hope to people like that, that maybe were, this is South Asian cultures, this is Asian cultures, this is Afghani cultures, where you're stuck in familial dynamics that are very toxic and they don't know how to get out. And shame. There's shame in talking about the shame. There's shame in exploring your personal development. There's fucking shame in wanting change. And so I just hope that like my background would assist some of those people, because I had so much trauma growing up. My father was a very violent man. He was a very scary man. And so my mom did the right thing, like when you grow up with a narcissistic father who's just misogynistic and very traumatized, it's appropriate to leave, but many people don't get that opportunity. And then you can't heal because you're stuck in that scenario.
Do you speak to women one-on-one about this sort of thing?
Yeah,
as well?
So the group the entertainment company that I spoke for, it was all their women. It was a women's summit. So I spoke about overcoming your limiting beliefs and the shame around change. Because a lot of times, even now in Western society, people think that, outing yourself in some way and saying, I have a problem or I feel shame or I'm scared is a weakness. And it's not. And so God forbid we ever expose ourselves to psychedelics because those are drugs, rather than a beautiful opportunity to introspect and learn about yourself and get a different perspective. Because once you see something, you can't unsee it.
Yeah.
And that's how your brain changes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. But like you talked about earlier, it's so important to have those structures of people and who can help facilitate growth, peers, whether they're hired or friends or family,
Totally.
And that brings me to a point that I wanted to address with you, because I saw that the consideration of empathy was something that that you have spoken about with regard to how it can facilitate smoother or more productive collaboration in the professional world. But I always refer to empathy as the human superpower.
Exactly.
I really do feel
that's the best thing I've heard all day.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
Well, it was worth coming in today after all.
That's beautiful.
That's my well, I just think about what differentiates human beings.
Especially coming from a male.
Oh, well.
Because men are, women are rewarded for this. Like, oh, you're giving, good for you. You're empathetic, but it's really important that you realize this.
Well, I just have always had a sense about energetics.
Yeah.
And just about
that's beautiful.
What that exchange is all about. And so I remember when I heard the term holding space, well,
Totally
it wasn't
right.
that, it wasn't that long ago, really, but it resonated for me. And sometimes people get snide about saying holding space, and it gets kind of it gets kind of battered a little bit. But I do feel like it's necessary to really consider the opportunity that we possess when we consider one another, And so being empathetic, I in working in this space and in learning about this space, you can do as many ceremonies of whatever as long as you need to.
Yeah.
Ultimately, how do you show up in the world
For sure.
for yourself and for other people?
Yeah.
And I do see
that's true.
I do see a lot of psychedelic drug use from people that I don't feel like are empathetically evolved.
Yeah, isn't that interesting?
I feel, look, I have a ton of human sympathy. I think it's a fucked up thing to be a human being, objectively,
totally.
that we don't really know why we're here. We're left to sort of figure it out.
Yeah.
And it's kind of a preposterous prospect, I think, full of incredible beauty and full of like really, really dizzying sadness, right? But empathy is something that I care a lot about. I try to think about, I just think about every day. And some of the things that I've done over time, like when I was younger, where I wasn't practicing empathy, have stuck with me. Those are marks too that I still dream about,
Beautiful.
And they're things that I can't change now.
Yeah.
But that's just an example of like, I feel like, and so how do you address, because it's such an important power, and I think it has, I think it's underutilized, underlearned, and so talk about the context in which you discuss empathy with anybody who is listening.
Yeah, it's such an important topic, and thank you for that. That really makes a lot of sense. Empathy has become, you know, not a buzzword, but like relevant, after the mental health crisis, sort of after COVID, like all that happened, like it's become, interesting to people. But to your point, like, I feel like to address the importance of empathy, we have to address why people are not empathetic to begin with. Like, we are all very sensitive human beings when we're born. Like,
what exactly do you mean by that?
Yeah, like we are very sensitive human beings. We're perfect when we're kids. Like our hearts are open, our brains are very malleable. What causes us to shut down aspects of ourselves, such as empathy or compassion? Because children are very empathetic and compassionate. They're open, they're fucking loving. I have, around the world, like India, Africa, Asia, Australia, meeting a 4-year-old, 3-year-old, they're loving. What happens for us to get that knocked out of us? That's like the thing that I'm very interested in, right? Like that's my work. Like what occurs inside of humanity for us to get that beaten out of us? And it's trauma. In one word, I believe it's trauma.
And let's hear in this context your definition and understanding of trauma.
Yeah, I mean, in the simplest way is when you've had moments that were shocking to your nervous system, that you felt threatened or scared and you froze or you were hurt in some way and it wasn't processed.
It didn't get processed because it was beyond the processing capability.
No, whether it was beyond or not, that's not the point. Trauma is a stuck emotion or an experience that doesn't get resolved. So the way that trauma works in our brain is that it's just ongoing. So when something really bad happens, our brain, you just remember that trauma and it's never ending. You just remember that experience and it's like looping in our brain. And then over time, we kind of cover it up, but it doesn't mean it's resolved. The way you know trauma is resolved is when you remember right before it happened, the traumatic incident happened and then it ended. And you have to know that you're okay psychologically. But in that moment, the traumatic experience happens, car crash happens, someone gets raped and you're like, oh, or like someone gets beat up, like terrible fucking trauma, like terrible trauma. And it's not emotionally addressed, our bodies freeze. We think like, oh my God, what's wrong with me? Why did this happen? Those emotions must be processed. Because if that happens enough and it's not processed, then we lose our empathy because we get dull. We lose our capacity to feel. So of course we can't feel empathy. I can't feel you if I don't feel myself and my own pain, It's like the solution is to feel. The solution is to love. And it's so hard to love. It's so hard to love when we don't trust people, when we've been hurt, when we've been whatever. And psychedelics get us enough out of our sphere, get us out of our trauma to recognize, oh my God, it's not my fault. Oh my God, I'm not so bad. I'm just traumatized. Literally, I remember doing Bufo, which is 5-MeO-DMT in Ibiza. And I remember I did it and I was just like, oh, like you just like fall back and then you get back up and it's like, 15 minutes has gone by and you've basically died. And like, it's very, very intense. And I remember the first thought I had after I did DMT was, oh, I'm not bad. There's nothing wrong with me. I just had trauma. There's nothing wrong with me. I was just traumatized. I was just hurt. I was just, in environments where I felt small and unseen and invaluable and bullied and, whatever, made fun of. And so I felt like I had to hide myself. Like I had to, show you that I was tough. This is why inherent systemic racism and misogyny and all of these things, are perpetuated by trauma, because you have traumatized cultures, right? And then you couple that with racism or hatred of women or whatever that breeds the trauma, and then you can never fix the issue. You can never get past it because it becomes systemic. And so the way to drop these systems and heal ourselves is to introspect. And I think sometimes it's too painful. It's too much, right? Like my mom, for example, like she's never done her work. What am I going to do? Like ask her to I have been doing this personal development work for half of my life. And, like, hey, Mom, why don't you process all of your trauma for the last 75 plus years? You can't, right? So that's when psychedelics become so relevant at any age. Small doses to help people wake up. Because if you can fly over the situation and see it wasn't your fault, then you don't blame yourself. The reason we're afraid of fucking change is because we blame ourselves, because we're like, it's not possible for me. It's too hard. I'm bad. It'll never work, right? The payoff, the secondary gain is stronger than my opportunity or hope for change. It's too scary. It's too threatening.
One of the things that I hope to do with this podcast is bring in people who are working with non-ordinary and extraordinary states of consciousness and something that I like to call flow state. Practices that take us, even if we can't commit to raising the entire rock and seeing and processing everything that's happened in our lives. I think that's one of the reasons why people are drawn to the performing arts or music in particular, because I feel like a song or a concert or a dance or dancing or singing can take us out of a lot of patterns that are crushing and omnipresent and unhealthy, right? And so I think that's kind of what's subtly at work in a lot of our recognition of the arts in particular. So that's one of the, that's just always kind of what I'm like inching towards, because it's generationally too. We love people in our families so much, and we're never going to be able to do for anyone else what we can hope to potentially do for ourselves. Do you have children?
No.
Do you have an aspiration to have children?
I don't know.
Yeah. I don't have children, but I have nieces and nephews, and I adore them, and I'm so grateful for the opportunity to have them. And when I think about my opportunity to impress upon or educate in any way or be an example, I'm just so grateful for that opportunity to have these incredible young people to try to, because I think about, both my parents have cancer right now, and that's something and it's like, it's I'm
so sorry.
I've thought about that a lot, and I think about the ties between our mentality and our physicality. And I think about things I observed in because I've always been an observant person, I think. And I think about things I've observed and energies that I've felt and been around, and what feels just innately healthy and what doesn't, right?
You have to be sensitive to have that observation. You have to have a sensitivity.
I think I do believe that I've also seen the sensitivity like hurt my nieces and nephews in particular. I know it hurt me too. Being sensitive can be extremely painful, right? But
I know.
I wanted to talk to you about this idea of triggers also too. When we talk about things that are painful and provocative, but how maybe when something is viewed as a quote unquote trigger, there are ways to engage that realization that can give lasting benefit, as opposed to something that needs to be turned away from all the time or avoided at all costs.
So are you asking like
What's your orientation around the concept of growing from a recognition
trigger?
of a trigger?
Yeah. Totally.
Please.
Totally. No, it's such a good question. I like live in that question. Like, well, first of all, I love Rumi. He's Afghani, by the way.
Yeah.
Yeah. And he has this quote that says something like, the wound is where the light enters you.
Yeah.
So like,
Leonard Cohen as well.
huh?
Leonard Cohen.
Yeah. Yeah.
Cracks are how the lights
Yeah.
gets in. Yeah.
Yeah. So that idea of going toward the wound is where the work is, like your response to the thing is the thing, and so
the journey and the voyage, the destination and the journey.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So I think it's really good to recognize what our triggers are. But I think a lot of times we don't know how triggered we are as a society and how to help ourselves through these triggers. For example, there can be societal triggers, there can be emotional triggers, there can be professional triggers, there can be political triggers. And so I think a lot of disease and, dis-ease and a lot of physical pain and all of that are just unresolved triggers that just eat away at our nervous system and our body and our wellness. And I think that we have a shame around that, which causes us to be even more triggered. And so I think it's very, very important to recognize, at least from an emotional perspective, what are the things that trigger me and who are the people and types of people that trigger me. So for example, I went to this seminar that last 5 days.
Seminar, yes.
Yeah, and this instructor didn't like me. It's like, dude,
That's something you picked up on?
I'm pretty. She made it very clear, and she was very triggered by me, and I approached her about it. It's like, it was normally I'm a very good student. So who she became in that moment for me was a disapproving teacher, right? Somebody where I was I felt, I could see myself. I felt like I was 10 years old. I'd every time I'd say something, she'd cut me down. Or one time I got up and I was I don't want to share this, but I really feel and she's well, sit back down. And I was no, I don't want to share, but I feel I have to. And she was totally mean. And I realized in that moment, I think I triggered her more than she triggered me. She became a disapproving something, but it didn't impact me enough to not to shrink, for example. But it was so interesting for me to see we can trigger people sometimes. And just by being ourselves, by being politically open, emotionally open, whatever, right?
Yeah.
And then if someone's rude to us or doesn't treat us well and are triggered by us, we don't always have to take that on and let that wound us or trigger us. But that's what we do, right? When we're in school and, 5th grade and someone's mean to you, you're oh my God, right? So recognizing the vibe with the triggers, in my opinion, is what is yours that you have to clean up, what's your side of the street and what's theirs. Because there are so many political, societal triggers all the time, we have to discern really fucking clearly, that is not mine. I'm not even going to go to that party. You don't have to attend every party you're invited to. You don't have to hop on the bus if it's not your destination. That wasn't my vibe with that instructor. I was what? Who knows who I became for her in that moment? Right? Because that's all triggers are. When we're upset, I'm not actually upset at you. You become my father. You become my mother. You become my whatever. And then I see you as that, and then I'm triggered by you. So nobody can make you feel any way. They can bring up a wound inside of you. Now, there's a lot of people that will continually press on a wound that they're not invited to press, and that's toxicity. So, like, you don't have to hang with them. But, like, nobody makes us feel anything. So we have to own what's ours, what's theirs.
Where do you think the best place for young people to be educated is? Like how I mean, we're talking about things that, I think we could bring in 12, 13, 14-year-olds and have this conversation with them. That's not happening.
No.
It's not happening.
Oh, I love that you said that. Yeah, I'm like, I have nieces too, and I'm just obsessed with them. And, I feel like in a utopian world, this would be part of our educational system rather than, replacing some historical dates and things like that with actual emotional intelligence education. Like, there are nonprofits. I sit on the board of a nonprofit that's really committed to supporting youth at risk with emotional intelligence and advocacy, So, like, through training, through access, through opportunities, like, you hear about all these young celebrities whose parents were celebrities, and the way they became famous and successful was through access. The difference between maybe myself and what occurred in really wealthy, famous families is that they had access. Same thing for children. Access is the number one source, I think. That's really incumbent upon our institution, our government, parents, obviously, but we can't rely on that, I think, Like, it would be beautiful to create systems where children are educated on this. Like, my 16-year-old niece went to this cool seminar around self-esteem and like expressing your emotions and yourself. And she was around a bunch of teens where it was very cool to own your stuff. And that was like so transformative,
Mm-hmm.
Like, how can we make it cool to look inside ourselves and take responsibility?
Yeah.
Media would be such a profound avenue for that.
Yeah. And I do, again, I'll tie it back to the media work that I've been a part of in the psychedelic space too. I do feel like if we can imbue this kind of content with that kind of consideration and make it accessible to people when they need to find it, that's something that's fun to do and good to do. I want to give you the opportunity. I want to thank you again for taking the time to come in, especially after the 5-day marathon impressive workshop.
Totally.
I want to give you the opportunity to leave with any last reflection on what you think is most important now for people to be considering. And I do feel like our conversation has reinforced my hunch that there was a very, very relevant connection here to this platform and to the world of the work that you're doing. So I'm delighted for that. But what's something that you would like to leave the audience with today?
I mean, first of all, thank you for doing the work that you're doing and spreading this message. It's so needed. I would just say if people are curious and interested about learning about their feelings, learning about what's possible for them, to just start somewhere. I don't think that it has to begin with psychedelics or end with psychedelics. Sometimes Louise Hay says this in her book, You Can Heal Your Life, which is my favorite book. Do you know the book?
I know the book.
It's a beautiful book. She said you can start with the health route. You can start with the meditation route. You can start in 12-step recovery, whatever. The goal is to reach out and ask for support. Release the shame, find community, find support. We're just not alone. Like, loneliness kills more than cigarettes. Did you know that? There was research done on this.
I've heard it. It still feels like extremely abstract, but it's totally resonant.
Yeah.
So as somebody who feels very lonely quite often.
Yeah, right? And it's an emotion. Like, you actually don't even have to physically be with someone to resolve some of this, right? Like, getting to a 12-step meeting or calling someone and feeling really seen and heard, like, it can do something to us. So the goal is that we're just not alone and to seek support. And I think with the work I do, I've always really appreciated understanding how your brain functions, because like when people would do energy work, like I couldn't feel it. I'm like, I'm a very sensitive person, but I just didn't understand it. Like
when it was being done with and for you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like, well, like how did this change my belief structure? How did this change my brain? How did this change my behavior? Right? Because someone else is in charge.
Yeah.
But like when you start to understand, here are my neurological blocks, here's how I'm shifting my belief structures, I'm really feeling like I'm shifting and my behaviors are changing and I'm positively rewiring my brain, that feels permanent to me, And so that's why I do the work I do. And I would just say, you're not alone, and please seek out support.
People who are interested in learning more about what you do or potentially working with you, what's the best way to access?
Yeah. At Amina Zamani for Instagram, LinkedIn, aminazamani.com, my website. Yeah.
Cool. Thanks so much for your time today.
Yeah, thank you.